During this time, he studied abroad in Russia and Eastern Europe and decided to further specialize in that area as he continued his education. He received a master's in Russian, Eastern European, Eurasian Studies from KU in 2013 and began a PhD in history at the University of Washington. So imagine when the NCAA basketball playoffs are going, yeah, rough time on who to root for. After completing his coursework, he moved home to Kansas to marry his wife Jocelyn and eventually moved home to McPherson. Since then, he has been a professor and staff member at McPherson College while completing work on his dissertation, From Stalingrad to Volgograd. I'm close, yeah. Stalinizing Soviet civilization, which examines urban reconstruction in the Soviet post-war era and the political upheaval following Joseph Stalin's death. And I'm very proud to introduce Matt Cotton today. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody first and foremost for coming out today. I am one to, I always want to talk about this stuff. So when the opportunity is presented to share what I know and with an interested party, with people who want to understand the region better, obviously Ukraine, outside of the celebrations, the 150 years, has been in the news quite a bit lately. And so what I wanted to do today, in addition to, first and foremost, thank you so much to Kathy and the organization for inviting me to speak. As I say, I very much enjoy talking and sharing about this. So what I wanted to do today, I'm coming into this with the idea that, and it's probably a wrong assumption, that people in this room have no idea, right? I want to build from the ground up. I want to assume that we have no shared information. So this is going to be a very general overview. And I want to talk both about the Swiss Mennonite experience in Ukraine and the subsequent immigration to the United States, but also give you a history of that region since then, both before and since then. So today's objectives, this is what I hope to accomplish in the next 50 minutes or so. We are going to attempt to situate the history of Ukraine as a place, Ukraine as an entity within the history of Russia. Because for much of that history, they've been intertwined, they've been shared. And so where do they intersect? Where do they separate? And who gets to decide that legacy? That's going to be one of the core themes that we examine. And of course, we're going to look at how the Ukraine ties into the story of Kansas, the Kansas Mennonite communities here today. And then finally, I want to examine the causes and the current state of the conflict in Ukraine. And whenever I set out to do that, people will ask me a lot of, so what do I need to know to understand this conflict? And I always say, it's really simple. You only need to know about 1,100 years. You need to know about 11 centuries worth of history, and then it all just clicks. It all makes sense. So I am going to start very early in the timeline, but I'm going to go pretty rapidly to get through that, so that hopefully you can see where some of those connections are and some of these historical underpinnings that make the world that we live in today. So some themes to consider, and these are going to be recurring throughout the centuries as we look at them. How are national identities created? How are ethnic identities created? Whether it be Ukrainian versus Russian or Mennonite, and how do those affect the way that we perceive the world around us? How do romanticized historical memories and war myths shape the current conflict? The way that we remember history is not always in line with the pure facts of history, right? We often receive a very sculpted view of history. So we're going to look a little bit at that. and really underlining how do the stories that we tell shape the choices that we make today. Because I think that's very key, understanding the stories that we tell ourselves, how we perceive our role in the world, and how those choices. So, let's start at the start. The Ukrainian state, as we know it, has existed since about the 9th century AD as a series of principalities known as the Rus. These are essentially feudal arrangements, and Kyiv on the Dnieper River emerges as the power in this kind of Eastern European steppe. If anybody has been to Ukraine, and I think that this is something that all Kansans should understand, is that geographically they're very similar places. Kansas and Ukraine, rolling steppe, very flat. They have a bit more rivers cutting things up, and the climate's a little bit further north, but has a lot in common with Kansas. And so Kyiv was a city on a river, on a major river, that became the kind of seat of its power. It was very ethnically diverse. There was no Ukrainians in the 9th century. There were Slavic groups, there were North groups, there were Finnic groups, there were steppe nomads. They'll come into the story here a little bit later. But the story, through the what is known as the primary chronicle, it's the kind of progenitor of all Russian history and now Ukrainian history. The primary chronicle recalls how the Rus was founded by 3 Varangian brothers, Ki, Shek, and Nikolaev, their sister Levin, who were invited to Kyiv to rule over the warring princes who could not rule themselves. So already you can see how the stories are getting told, right? They were just invited in. Sure they were. At its outset, you can see the map is a little bit hard to read. The overlay, Kyiv is at the very southern end. It's this star here. And in the original Rus, these principalities, you have Poland to the east still. You have remnants of the Roman Empire. You have the Byzantines in the Black Sea. You'll soon have the Ottoman Turks in the Caucasus. But for the time being, they stretch up north to even almost to a little provincial town called Muscat. A shared culture is established through the missionary work of the Saints Cyril and Methodius. So these 2 Byzantine missionaries, they come to the region with the intent to spread Christianity in the region. In order to further this goal, they actually come up with an alphabet. These very dispersed tribal groups do not have a shared language, shared alphabet. And so Cyrillic, the alphabet that is now used in Russia and even to a large degree in Ukraine today, is derived from what they came up with. It becomes the official state language when King Yaroslav the Wise is converted to Christianity. He's baptized as part of his coronation and becomes the official state language. So they are Christians, but they are Orthodox Christians. So you have the split between Byzantium and Rome, and they follow the path of the Greek church in Rome, that tradition. They also, you have the first legal code written by Yaroslav the Wise. Oh, I'm sorry, I got Vladimir and Yaroslav mixed up there. This is the first time, nearly a century and a half after the Rus was founded, that you have a shared legal code that establishes property relations, that establishes tax relations among the population. Predominantly peasant, I should mention. So Kiev's heyday lasts for about a century and a half. And then you have the incursions by what will come to be known as the Crimean Tatars, remnants of the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan, who have swept west out of the steppe of Asia. Their cavalry units are unmatched. And so Kyiv, out on a broad plain where cavalry thrives, is unable to hold, unable to stand against this might. And the Tatars, they established their own Khanate on the peninsula of Crimea. Now, Kievan princes will end up paying essentially protection money to the Khanate for several centuries. But the Tatar reach does not extend up into the forests in the north. Their horses can't get the free ground that they love. And so up in the north, a walled city by the name of Moscow, begins to be the new gathering place of political power of the boyars. These are the liege lords, the feudal lords that own land in the Kievan Rus. They begin pledging their loyalty to what becomes known as a czar. A czar just means king. It means Caesar. It's literally derived from the word Caesar. They're tracing that Romantic heritage back through the church. And over time, Muscovy grows to be a state strong enough to challenge the Khans. Now, Russian expansion is a slow and grinding process over the centuries, and it's actually not for another almost 600 years that Kiev will be reincorporated back into the Russian state by the Tsar, the first Romanov, Alexei Mikhailovich. So you can see the Moscow area, this is where it starts. And the expansion is very gradual. They expand to the east, they expand to the north, and then finally, in the 17th centuries, when they finally make their way back to what had been the original point of origin for the Rus, and Kiev is incorporated in, I believe, 1645. I don't know how to go back to that. I should put it on the slide. In that time, in that intervening time, this area, in addition to the Cossacks, the Crimean Tatars, Poland, Lithuania has become a major kingdom. So you have Catholic influence through the Polish, all the way up through into Estonia. You have challenges also from Sweden. Sweden is a major player at this point in geopolitics in Eastern Europe. And now that kind of brings us to the point. This is the shared history. That's where the history diverges, and then it comes back together. And now, to understand the Mennonite side of the history, we have to actually back up still a couple more centuries to this man here, Peter the Great. So Peter, you could consider the first modern emperor of the Russian Empire. Peter the Great, before he becomes Tsar, after he takes over from his father Alexei, he tours Europe. And what he sees is that the Russian Empire, this very peasant-based economy, in their very traditional Orthodox customs, compared to what they see as the dynamic, up-and-coming Europe. Think naval expansion at this time, right? You've got the discovery of the New World, you've got trade routes, shipping to India and China. Peter sees that, and he sees Russia as fundamentally backward. Now, this idea of backwards and modernity, this is still kind of a core question around a lot of studies today, but this idea that somehow we're behind the curve. And Russia, ever since Peter the Great, has felt behind the curve. And I think that you can see, as the rest of this history progresses, there is a sort of national identity around this need to modernize, this need to become more modern. So one of the first things Peter does in order to pursue this goal, he incentivizes land reforms, he incentivizes capital investment, really wants a navy. He moves the capital to the White Sea, a city that would become known as St. Petersburg. He institutes things like the beard tax, where nobles in the court are no longer allowed to wear their traditional Orthodox beards. This creates a huge stir. This is unheard of. And so you can see Peter the Great. Tsars for about the next 200 years will have this clean-shaven look. The beard is important. We'll come back to the beard. He declares himself the first emperor of Russia in 1721. And it's his dynasty that will then prolong into, essentially, to the end of the collapse of the Russian Empire. So, I've mentioned that Russia's agricultural sector was predominantly peasant-based. It's a peasant-based society. They're built around church holidays. Life in the villages is very much governed by state bureaucrats and the church. Planting seasons are dictated by the church. You know when the seed needs to go in the ground because it's right after Easter. That's when the ground is good enough to work. And so those church holidays really control the rhythms of life. Now, because Russia is such a vast place, if you think of that, if you think back to that map, that's thousands of square kilometers. These strung out villages, very hard to centrally organize. There's not a lot of major cities within them. And so there's a very low education level, very low literacy rate among these populations. And there is, at this point, still very little mechanization. Right? Mechanization of agriculture in Europe will begin taking off around Peter's time, a little bit later. You get things like the mill, and we won't see tractors for a bit yet. But they're doing all of this by hand, these peasant village collectives working the land by hand. And it's not the most efficient way to collect grain. Famine is very frequent in the Russian Empire. And so the way that, too, that peasants are tied, so the word for peasant in Russian is actually krestyan. It's Christian. That's actually how they are referred. But they are also serfs. The feudal system of serfdom governs property relations, where the lords, the boyars, they own land, and the serfs are bound to that land. It's not quite the same system as, say, American chattel slavery, but it shares many similarities where serfs do not have the same freedoms. They can't travel for work. They can't, say, travel into the city to work in a factory. Right? They are bound to that land. They are bound to their nation. And this system, from Peter onwards, is seen as this, it's the crutch. Russia is backwards. Why are we backwards? Our agricultural sector cannot produce enough. We don't have money for industry. So how do we fix that? There's a bunch of different options of what people think to do, but it's Catherine the Great, Peter's it's Peter III's wife. And when he passes away, after only 6 months of his reign, his wife Catherine will then oversee the Russian Empire for the next 30 years. She's a major figure. And it's at a very dynamic time of Russia's history. She sees still, she wants to be an enlightened monarch. She comes from this tradition, this is before, when she starts her reign, this is before the French Revolution really shakes up monarchical politics in Europe. And still the idea of a divine monarch that is ruling justly for her people through these most logical systems. She very much sees herself cut from that mold. Serfdom, though, remains a problem. It remains even 50 years later after Peter's rule, it remains a problem. And the peasants, the revolt by a peasant named Pugachev, creates this a real threat to the monarchical power of Catherine and the Tsars. So she knows that she needs to do something. Now, Catherine is, she's German. She's from a German ruling house. She was married to Peter III as a political alliance, but she still has ties back to the former Habsburg Empire, Austria-Hungary, the old Holy Roman Empire. And it's through that, she looks at their economic system, and she sees, you have the spread of Protestantism in the German colonies, and you have a lot of very wealthy, very prosperous agricultural communities there. And so she extends an invitation to all sorts of different groups from around back central Western Europe, that if they come to Russia, if they come to Russian-held lands, they will be able to practice their religion. They will be exempt from military service. They'll be exempt from specific tax codes, and they'll have a priority on land. And so this ends up being a very enticing proposal to a lot of different groups, including the Swiss Mennonite communities that will make their way to Russia during this time. You can see here kind of the distribution of a lot of these various groups. Now, I will say not all of these groups are Mennonite. Many are, but you have, for instance, the Volga Germans in Saratov and to the north. All of these areas in yellow are kind of where the heaviest immigration is, and you can see some of the towns even. Most of the Swiss Mennonite communities are in this region west of Ukraine, the Bohemian region. So here we zoom in a little bit. You can see the modern day borders of kind of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania. This series of communities here on the road kind of to Kyiv become a sort of ethnic enclave of Mennonite communities. Within the Russian Empire, they still speak German or variations of German. They still practice their religious policies. They are working alongside ethnic Ukrainian or ethnic Russian peasants as well. Their communities are more separate, but there is that level of connection, right? Ukrainian going to Kyiv or to Lvov. There's a lot of contact. One of the things that I really want to drive home is how ethnically diverse Ukraine was. And I say was, and we'll get to that. But it was a very vibrant place where you had many communities living next door to each other, where multiple religions are being practiced, multiple languages are being spoken. It's this borderland between empires, between Poland, between Austria-Hungary, between Sweden, between even the Ottomans, right? Including in this area, this would have been what was known in the Russian Empire as the Pale of Settlement. So in addition to Mennonite communities, Eastern European diaspora Jews settled by the hundreds of thousands in what is now Ukraine. Now, they were limited to Ukraine. So you can see a couple of provinces just to the east of Kyiv. And then there's this line. Jews were not allowed to settle beyond these lines into what was seen as Russia proper. They were not able to assimilate into the upper reaches of Russian government. They were not able to attend Russian universities. And so while they were allowed to stay here, they were also kept very separate. They spoke their own Yiddish dialect that was different from both German and Russian. They had to deal with, oftentimes, anti-Semitic violence directed at Jewish communities, which led to, for instance, the Jews of Odessa, which is down here, forming their own self-defense collectives, known as the Bund. Particularly towards the end of the 19th century, this becomes a major point in Jewish politics. And if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, if we have fans of Fiddler on the Roof, Fiddler is very much set in here, and Tevye's daughters are often seen as an allegory. You had three choices if you were Jewish in the Russian Empire. You could choose to essentially nationalize yourself, give up your Jewishness, and become Russian to fit in. You could reject the empire, you could become a revolutionary, you could be somebody pushing back against, or you could do what Tevye's family ultimately does and emigrate. So it's around this time in the 19th century that Ukraine as an idea begins to formulate. Up until this time, Ukrainian it's a word that does not hold the same connotations today. Ukrainian effectively means Little Russians, and that's how they're seen in the Slavic world. You also have Belarusians, the White Russians, and you have these various Slavic groups, and they're seen as a fraternity among Slavic groups. So Ukrainian, or Russian, or Belarusian, or even Czech, Slovak, even to an extent Poles, although the whole Catholicism puts a wrench in it. There is a unity among Slavs. There's this movement, Slavophilia. But there's also a Ukrainian national movement of saying we are distinct. We are not just Russians. We have our own history. We have our own values. We have our own ideas. We have our own language. And so Ukrainian as a language, which is a dialectical difference from Russian. There is some very substantial differences in the dialect and now even in the language. Ukrainian adopts more Latin characters. So it's a mix of Cyrillic and Latin alphabets. But when you have poets, songwriters, you have literary figures like Ivan Franklin, thank you. Slide, thank you, Pastor Matt. They're helping define what it is through their writings, through they're writing about Ukrainian themes. They're writing odes to being Ukrainian. They're helping define what Ukrainian is. And it's in opposition to distinctly Russian. Right? That by declaring I am Ukrainian, that sets me apart from Russia. So speaking Ukrainian becomes somewhat an act of rebellion. Now, they also have a very different culture that they can draw on, and one of those, probably the most distinctly, or at least the most romanticized version of Ukrainians that we see, is the Cossacks. The Cossacks are a group based around the Dnieper River and in the Don and all the way down even to Crimea. They're a group that adopted the cavalry tactics of the Khanates. So horseback archery, horseback sabers. They become a very militaristic culture. They have their own distinct styles of dress. They have their own unique styles of hair. This top knot that you'll see. They'll shave their whole head, and then there's a single strand of hair that they'll grow super long, and then you curl it around. All this very distinctly culturally different place. So, this Ilya Repin work, Reply of the Zaporozhian Cossacks. This is the idea that Ukrainians are beginning to identify themselves with. All Ukraine, even if you're a peasant in the fields, you may start pulling into that Cossack mentality. The Cossacks win acclaim and win special privileges from the Russian regime because of their martial talents, because they are essentially a warrior mercenary culture. And so they will fight alongside the Russian army. They will act as shock cavalry troops. And they were largely feared. They were very effective on the battlefield. But increasingly, as the Tsars run into trouble, political trouble of their own, you'll see the Cossacks being called into Russian cities. So the Cossacks are called into places like St. Petersburg and Moscow and Odessa to put down revolts. So it's basically like suddenly seeing the National Guard roll up in tanks through your town if the Cossacks come to town. Very feared group. And this martial identity, right, that's at the core of Cossacks, very much is important. Now, again, as Ukrainian identity is on the rise, so too is Russian nationalism. A new Russian national identity founded around belief in orthodoxy, around the belief in the right to rule of the Tsar. Tsar Alexander II, sometimes Alexander the Great, it will be him that finally abolishes serfdom. He gets the name the Great Reformer, or the Great Liberator. Does away with serfdom in 1863, right around the time of the Civil War. It's happening here at the end of slavery in America. But in that same year, he decides to ban Ukrainian language, seeing the Ukrainian national identity as a wedge being driven into his multi-ethnic empire. He wants to cut off the threat of secession. And in 1976, he actually bans the use of Ukrainian in published texts. So no more newspapers, no more books in Ukrainian. Which, if that's your primary language, think of how that hits you. Right? Despite all of this, Alexander II is ultimately assassinated by revolutionaries from the People's Will, Narod and Volya. And it's his death in 1881 that really kicks off an expedition of the process. Now I know I've jumped 1874, but I'm going to come back to the province. So Alexander's son, Alexander III, is the most Russian Tsar. Well, notice, the beard is back. We have adopted the beard. We are no longer seeking to just become something like, we don't need to become like the West. We are our own thing. We are Russia. We have our own path to greatness. And he begins, and really doubles down on a lot of policies that his father had of Russification, and to homogenize imperial Russian culture. Try to bring it back in. Try to bring all these different national groups around a shared identity. And so Russians, ethnic Russians, now become the predominant minority. And during this time, the non-Russian minority groups, Mennonites, Germans, Armenian Tatars, they lose those privileges. They started to lose them under Alexander II. It really kicks off under Alexander III, where no longer are they exempt from serving in the military. This is very good, as you can imagine. They're no longer able to speak their own dialect in their schools, in their churches. And so this is about the time that we see this big move to the United States from these Swiss Mennonite communities. It's through this rise of Russian nationalism that we begin to see these non-Russian ethnicities begin to be pushed out of this region, this very ethnically diverse region. So one kind of side effect of abolishing serfdom, suddenly you have all these peasants who hadn't owned their own land, now they're clamoring to buy land. And so land is becoming very scarce, particularly farmland for large families. Typically a large family, they would, as their son or daughter becomes of age, they would get part of their plot, or they would, as part of that dowry, they would have a new farm. And as that land becomes scarce, so too does the prospect of upward mobility. So too does your idea of, will my children have the same opportunities that I do? They are also, Catherine saw them as being very productive. They are typically some of the wealthier communities in this area of Ukraine. And that raises a certain level of distrust among local Russian groups. But it's in 1874, and I saw that date, and I was like, man, whatever could that be? What happened exactly 150 years ago that could relate to this? The first scout groups come to the United States. And it's not all at once, right? It's not everybody just packed up in their wagon train and the whole village was gone. Communities would send scouts to go find the potential places to settle. And what they found when they came, particularly here to Kansas and also South Dakota, is that the climate was just what was needed to continue farming the wheat that they were so accustomed to farming in Ukraine. The winter wheat crop that we still see now, it's coming up nicely. If you guys have been driving through the fields, on the way here, it's looking great. That's the same crop, by and large, of what they were farming in Ukraine. The journey to get to the coast was, they were uprooting their whole lives. Wagons, you had to get, first of all, to the coast, possibly through Austria-Hungary, possibly through the White Sea, get to Britain, charter a ship across the Atlantic, and then once you're here in the United States, you've got to get on the train for who knows how many days, and then voila, you get to start your new life. Something that all of us look forward to doing. Everybody loves moving, right? I should know. I hope to not do it. But, so you have to understand that this was not an easy choice, right? A lot of families were well established. A lot of families were well off. And yet making that choice to come to the States was one of not just their future, but also their family's future in what was looking to be a country that was becoming rapidly set against them. And this is right before the turn of the century. And this migration, this will happen over the decades. But it happens right before the cataclysm of World War I. So this is kind of back to part one redux, right? How, again, we're talking shared history between Ukraine and Russia and how that history relates to the current conflict. The Russian Empire still holds together all the way up until 1917. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 is a major strain, but Russia is seen as still, after all these modernizing reforms, they're seen to have a competent navy, they have one of the largest standing armies in the world. It was thought that they would be very decisive. But what the strain of war does is that it brings out all the inefficiencies in the Russian system. It brings them to a head at a time of crisis for the autocracy. Now, the battle lines here for World War I, again, this is farmland. So when you think of World War I in the West, in France and Germany, you think of trenches, right? Long time spent in the trenches, maybe millions of men fighting and dying over just a handful of miles. Not so in the East. The East is one giant moving battlefield where armies are sweeping back and forth. And you can imagine what it's like to be a peasant in this region at that time. So World War I is the strain, is the final nail that breaks the camel's back. You have a series of revolutions, one in February 1917 that overthrows the Tsar, and then you have the collapse of the provisional government, the democratic institution that was proclaiming to write a new constitution for Russia. They're deposed by a group known as the Bolsheviks later on that year in the October Revolution. Now, I would love to speak at length about the entire history of the Soviet Union. I'm gonna not. I'm gonna restrain myself and keep to the parts that matter. The Civil War that breaks out in the wake of the Bolshevik seizure of power has the White Army forces loyal to the Tsar that want to reinstate the monarchy. They still hold. So this basically red area is how the Russian Empire shrinks as the Bolsheviks are struggling to hold on to this fledgling socialist state. Once again, Ukraine becomes a battleground. The White Army forces of Admiral Denikin are here, as well as you also have Ukrainian nationals who are operating at this time trying to essentially argue for Ukrainian statehood, whether that be as part of the new Soviet state, where they will be a socialist republic, separate but equal, or as just a Ukrainian state, forming a Ukrainian state. And it's only due to the Red Army being able to eventually, by 1922, kind of reestablish a lot of the borders of the Russian Empire. They're going to lose a lot over here to Poland as they get their way out of World War I in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. But for the large part, the Russian Empire remains intact. But just to show kind of an idea of what Ukrainians thought of, how they thought of themselves in 1919, this is a postcard imagining a map of Ukraine. This is Crimea. This is Lvov, this is Poland. And this is the entire Caucasus. I mean, this is Georgia, Armenia, not quite Azerbaijan. But it looks a lot different, right? The idea, this was seen as Cossack territory. What eventually does happen is that the Soviet Union becomes the main entity, and Ukraine does become incorporated as a member republic. What that means is under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, they are allowed to keep that Ukrainianness. They are encouraged to be Ukrainian. National in content, Soviet in character becomes the tagline. So you can express your Ukrainianness as long as it relates back to the larger socialist project. It's in that pursuit of internationalism. But Stalin's other policies will have a radical impact on all the member states, but particularly Ukraine. So one major thing, again, that idea that Russia is backwards, that the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks inherited a backward state, and they need to modernize in order to survive. One thing that still remains a thorn in the side is agriculture. And the way that Stalin proposes to do that is through collectivization, where all of these tiny peasant villages where the land is divided up into kind of these thin strips owned by individual families, harvested by hand, still not a lot of tractors, still not a lot of mechanization in agriculture. We're going to take several of those communities, bring them together on a collective farm, nationalize those lands, and have them work them collectively. We'll set up a tractor station so that they actually have modern technology, and this will be the problem that solves Soviet agriculture. So you have a couple of propaganda posters from the kind of socialist realism era. Come, comrades, join us at the Kohal's, the collective farm. And you also have down with the kulaks from the collective farms. Kulak is a word that means, in Russian, fist. In the sense, kulak, of agricultural, it means the greedy peasants. The ones who have taken more from themselves. They might be the peasants that have done well for themselves enough to hire hands, to hire people to help with the harvest. They're the wealthiest peasants in town. But again, if there are Mennonite communities left who have done well for themselves, suddenly this new label, kulak, can be attributed to you as well. It's not a national it's not a national demarcation, it's a class one. Right? You have not become a national enemy, you're a class enemy. And dekulakization is an extremely brutal process. Farmers are incentivized to point out kulaks to the internal security services. The requisitioning of grain, after years of warfare, civil warfare, famine, Stalin has cities to feed, cities full of workers. And so the requisition of grain, instead of bread for kulaks, bread for socialists. Often this included the seed grain for next year's harvest. You can't have a next year's harvest without that seed grain. And so for 3 years, you have mass displacement of peasants from both Ukraine and all around Russia. This is not, again, this is not a national campaign directed at Ukrainians. It is directed at peasantry. Stalin has effectively declared war on the Soviet peasantry. Millions are forced into exile or to the collective farms. You have a really difficult choice to make. You can leave behind your homes. Many peasants tried to hide grain, which could get them convicted of either sabotage, wrecking, sent to the Gulag, the Soviet prison camps. And as a result of these collective policies, over the course of the next, from about 31 to 33, we have an event that's remembered in Ukraine today as the Holodomor, the mass starvation of peasants in Ukraine. Estimates will say anywhere between 3 and 5 million people die during this time due to a man-made starvation. Holodomor, as it's remembered in Ukraine, sees it as a genocide specifically directed at Ukrainians because Ukrainians were the most hardest hit from these policies. And it's remembered as such in Kyiv today. Okay. How am I doing that time? All right, how do you go? World War II. Again, very close to my heart. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of it. Stalin's whole reason for being is that he needs to get the Soviet Union ready to take on the existential threat of fascism that is coming from the West. Specifically the state of Nazi Germany, which has a very, the national identity of the master race is that the Slavs are superior. Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, they are inferior to Germans. And so his idea, Hitler's idea, and he talks about this in his writings quite a bit, is the idea of Lebensraum, elbow room for the German people. He wants to come particularly into any areas that have German-speaking populations and create this greater Germany, create more farmland. And this is, again, some of the best farmland in Europe. So Stalin knows this. Stalin knows that he has this existential flank on his western border. And what he does is he buys time. He decides to carve up Poland, which this is the entry, right? At this point, Germany had been into Czech, they'd been into Austria, the Anschluss has happened, this appeasement policy has not been working out. The invasion of Poland is what kicks off World War II, right? That's what brings the Allies in. But not the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union will be happy to take the land all the way to Warsaw, give me a nice buffer zone against the Nazi onslaught, and I need more time. Stalin needs more time, is what he thinks. He doesn't get it. 3 years later, we have Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. It's a surprise blitzkrieg attack. And again, just like this area of land was suitable for cavalry warfare, it is doubly suitable for tank combat. So you have the Wehrmacht absolutely pushing the Soviets back. They're completely taken by surprise. And once again, this area becomes a battlefield. Now, it's only 3 years later, after the Battle of Stalingrad, that then it turns around and comes back. The front line moves back through. So there's not a moment of peace in World War II. This is an incredibly desperate time for the people of Belarus and Ukraine. They are on the front lines. Life under Nazi rule was treacherous for a number of reasons. Not only just the fact that you're enemy civilians. You could choose, for one, to resist. You could flee into the forests, band together like the Bielski Partisan group in Belarus. There's a great Daniel Craig movie, Defiance, if you've seen it. If you're interested in that, very, very good depiction. They do guerrilla warfare tactics and try to disrupt them things. However, there's also many who choose to collaborate, who work with the Germans to set up a new occupation government. Now, if you choose to do that, if you choose to work with the Nazis, imagine what happens when the Soviets come back through. You are not seen upon favorably. And so you've got this series of impossible choices, one after the other. Do I collaborate with the Nazis? Do I risk that? Do I flee into the woods and resist? Or do I just try to keep my head down? Every group had a different choice to make. This is also where the Holocaust begins. Right? The Holocaust ends, as we see it, what we most think of as the camps. Where it begins is in Soviet Ukraine. This is, after all, the Pale of Settlement, where anywhere between 3 to 5 million Jews are currently living. The Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began in summary executions, it began with pogroms, it began in concentrating Jewish populations. In Kyiv, in particular, you have the Babi Yar massacres, where in 3 days, 33,000 Jews are told to leave their homes, basically marched outside the city, stripped of their possessions, and summarily executed. 33,000 in 3 days. And this is a war, the first real, true, total war. Civilian populations are in play. On the left, you can see Kreshati Boulevard in Kyiv. On the right, Stalingrad, where I'm doing my research on the rebuilding. Basically, how did 20 years later, what did the city look like after it was reduced to a series of Swiss cheese buildings? The amount, I cannot stress this enough, the Ukrainian and Soviet and Russian memory of the war, of World War II, is different from ours. And it's because the war took place there. And it was at a staggering cost that the Nazis were finally driven back. 20 to 30 million people died. To put that into perspective, all combatants of the U.S. troops, I believe, make up just below 500,000. 20 to 30 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died. Russian and Ukrainian combined. And so the war is remembered very differently. This was a fight for survival, where if the Nazis win, we're gone. We're wiped out. We're either slaves, we're servitude. So it's remembered in this defense of the motherland, particularly by the Soviets. So again, comparing Stalingrad on the right and Kyiv on the left, similar depictions. the motherland holding a sword, and in one case a shield aloft, both overlooking major rivers, Russian rivers. Now, this sickle and hammer up here on the shield, that's been replaced with the Ukrainian trident, just recently. But this shared solidarity, just as Alexander II, Alexander III were trying to create a shared homogenized identity, so too did the Soviets. A brotherhood between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people. We survived this conflict together, and so now we are bound, essentially, together forever, eternally tying its fate with the brotherly Russian people. The Ukrainian people saved themselves from foreign enslavement, allowing the possibility of national development. This is from 1954. Just a few years before so after Stalin's death in 1953, a Ukrainian will become the premier of the Soviet Union, a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. You guys may, I don't know how long ago this was for you, maybe you remember him, begs his shoe on stuff, really love corn. Very bombastic guy. He gives Crimea to the Ukrainian state. He takes it from the Russian Soviet Republic and gifts it to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic as a symbol of this brotherhood. You also have in 1982 this arch that goes up, and this image on the right here might have been familiar from that first slide. You have the Ukrainian worker, you have the Russian worker. This guy's head is now missing, and in fact I believe they've demolished the rest of the monument to Ukrainian and Russian brotherhood. That's how long it lasted, 30 years. So that brings us to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So again, the Soviet Union, just like the United States, is a collection of states. Russia is the biggest, but Ukraine is also a major agricultural region, but it's got its own local autonomous governments. They're allowed to kind of do their own thing. When the Soviet Union breaks apart in 1991, Ukraine becomes its own entity. The state of Ukraine, the sovereign state of Ukraine, no longer tied to the Soviet Union, just as Russia becomes the Russian Federation. So you have 15 other member republics. They tried a commonwealth, kind of similar to what Britain did with its colonies when it decolonized after World War II. An economic commonwealth. It lasts a few years. In 1994, though, and this is critical, the Budapest Memorandum basically commits that the US, Russia, and the UK committed to respect the independence and sovereignty of the existing borders of Ukraine and refrain from the threat of use of force against that country if Ukraine is willing to give up the nuclear arms that the Soviet Union had stored there. This is the assurance that is signed off on by both the US government, the UK, and at the time Yeltsin's government in Russia. If this memorandum does not go into effect, maybe we have a different story, but unfortunately, again, the choices that we make tend to have this tendency of shift in the future. So Ukraine gives up its status as a nuclear power. Imagine roughly anyone on the world stage doing that today. It's about the only time that I can point to. The Ukraine and Russia both become American-style democracies. They import capitalism. They import democracy. It's a very guided transition. Bill Clinton, George Bush are seen as partners in developing this kind of transition. You have the first McDonald's opening on Main Square. But shock therapy, this transition from a nationalized, planned economy that the Soviets had to this very, stock markets, capitalism, franchises, all these things. The Russian people and the Ukrainian people, they have to learn that. And there is a learning curve. And the people that are teaching them are the sharks of the business school of the US in the 1980s. Like Gordon Gekko, greed is good. And so what you get, you have these privatization vouchers. Every worker in the factory that used to have a owning stock in the factory was issued essentially this bank voucher that says, here's your shares of the company. And they say, what do you want me to do with this? What is this? This is a piece of paper. What do I do with it? Now, the people that do understand what it is, they say, oh, you don't need that. Let me take that off your hands for you. And so you get the oligarchs. This is a very fundamental to understanding both Ukrainian democracy, Russian democracy. It's pay to play, right? And the people that now own, a lot of these guys, telephone networks, gas companies, oil companies. Now they own soccer teams. They diversify their portfolios, but they own the moving parts of the Russian economy after it denationalized. And so you have the winners and you have the losers. The 1990s, particularly for Russians, the ruble crashes in 1998 in a way that leaves basically pensioners penniless, homeless. Suddenly their savings account, their pensions that were guaranteed by the state under the Soviet Union, they're worth nothing. And so you have this real sense among Russians in particular that something needs to change. We had it better under the Soviets. Now we've got the oligarchs in charge, we've got the gangs in charge, the mafia is big in Russia. They basically own Yeltsin, the president. And so we have a man saying, I can fix it. And it's Yeltsin's chosen successor, comes to power in 2000, year 2000, and he is still the president of Russia to this day, after a brief flip-flop in 2008 as the vice president. This is when he comes into power, and basically his guarantee to the Russian people is, I will get the oligarchs under control. And he does, to an extent, by basically threatening them the same way that, you can either play ball, or you can end up in a Russian prison. Most of them play ball. And this is how Russian influence largely works in the former Commonwealth. You have a series of client states. Russian-favored politicians who are oligarchs themselves or supported by oligarchs who can easily be controlled by Putin because Putin controls the purse strings. In 2004, you have the first instance where Ukraine in particular leads the charge in pushing back against this influence. The Orange Revolution, the protests that erupted in the heart of Kyiv against Moscow's preferred candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, seeing there were voting irregularities, they were caught, and it turns out that his rival actually won. These protests essentially force the vote that make that happen, or force the recount that makes it happen. But then, 2013, Yanukovych is in power. He doesn't go away after trying to steal an election. He's back in power in 2010. Again, he's got Putin's backing. He is the preferred candidate. And it's as Ukraine is starting to look to the West. You have the expansion of the European Union. You have the expansion of NATO into these former Eastern European communist countries. And it's Euromaidan. When you see the blue, we go from orange, so many of the colors are that blue and yellow with the Ukrainian flag. When I was there in 2012, it was just before Euromaidan kicked off, just less than a year before. And this federal building here, there was an encampment here that even in the summer of 2012 was already set up, just protesting Russian influence, protesting corruption in the Ukrainian system. And it's these protests, Euromaidan, in the winter of 2013-2014, that forces Yanukovych to flee. He flees to Russia because he sees his ouster at the hands of this revolt. He's losing control, which is the direct cause of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This is Putin's chance to flex. That shows Ukraine what that power is and what he can do with it. So if you'll remember, it seems ages ago now, basically overnight, a surprise wave of Russian troops flood into the Crimean Peninsula, backed by the Russian Navy, and they set it up for a vote to become a part of Russia. They attempt to do the same thing in the east, where Eastern separatists, Russian-speaking groups, take up arms and try to push for their own separation. They actually face Ukrainian resistance, and you have Putin's troops coming across the border, these shadow troops, not wearing the Russian flag on their uniforms, but are either mercenary groups or just units fighting out of uniform. The war in Ukraine started in 2014. It just picked up in 2022. And the reason is, it goes back to that idea of ethnicity. And it goes back to that idea of what is your national heritage. Do I speak Russian in the home? Do I speak Ukrainian? Do I speak something else entirely, like Crimean Tatar? Do I practice Islam? But in the East, where the points of contact are most strong, you have the most identifying as Russian. And it gives Putin that idea of, I'm going to reunite the Russian people with their Russian homeland. Ukrainian is a fake entity. Something that a bunch of philosophers thought up in the 19th century. So that lays the groundwork. The other big thing is the expansion of NATO. And I don't want to dwell on this too much, but Putin's still very much in the mentality of the Cold War. It's Russia versus the West, being hemmed in on both sides. And NATO is the prominent power in that, right? This North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this alliance of states. The former Eastern Bloc used to include part of Germany, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, Romania. All of these that are now NATO states used to be they used to be Warsaw Pact states. And so you can see that creep. And if Ukraine were to come, that means that Russia has NATO right on its borders. Now, it will anyway, because Sweden and Norway, or Sweden and Finland both try to join up, and so that's going through, kind of a backfire there. But in 2022, we have on February 24th, I remember the evening very distinctly. February 23rd is my birthday, and so I got the news coming across my newsfeed channels late that night that, oh God, something's happening. Real quick, I'm already 5 minutes over the time that I said I was going to go, and so I want to do this very quick recap of what has happened since then. A rapid recap of the war so far. So Zelensky addresses the nation the night of, essentially basically says, the fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride. Putin was banking on him heading for the hills. The fact that he stayed meant the conflict keeps going. It gives the people of Kyiv another reason to fight. You have Russian air superiority, but and naval superiority that they are not able to make full use of. You have the Snake Island resistance, which has been forever immortalized with a phrase that I'm not going to repeat in church. You have the ghost of Kyiv, the aerial ace, which was actually about 6 different fighter pilots, but it's the mythos, right? It's the mythos of war. You had attacks that were actually hitting Kyiv. This is a tower block in the Oblon neighborhood of Kyiv, which it looks remarkably similar to the one that I stayed in when I was there, in that same neighborhood. So that struck me. You had the column advancing on Kyiv, right? Putin is looking to deal that death blow, get it over with early, so you have thousands of Russian troops on the move. Well, they're in a big long line, and if you stop the car in front, the traffic jam, and so you have them strung out for miles. They are never able to take the Hospital Airport outside of Kyiv, and they're never able to ferry troops in. So they get bogged down, and the advance on Kyiv stalls. In Russia, you have this trend, the Z. That is not a character that exists in the Cyrillic alphabet. That is a Western character. But Z, Zapad, means west, or Zapovedi, to victory. You still see these Z's dubbed on everything. It became a very watermark of, do you support the war in Russia? And while the march on the capital is stopped, the initial Russian offensive is able to gain large portions of these 4 provinces along the eastern border. You also have troops able to station up in Belarus and come over. You have a mass displacement of refugees from Ukraine. Hundreds of thousands in those early days, fleeing for the borders. I had several friends, myself, from Kyiv that either ended up in Lviv, some that went to Romania. A lot of uncertainty. A lot have moved back since then, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. You had the liberation of Bucha, which was where we saw Russian atrocities kind of in their full. The occupation was brutal to civilian populations. That was very different talk. I'm not going to bog down in that for right now, but I can come back to it. You have the Battle of Mariupol, a city of 500,000 people on the coast. Again, urban destruction becomes a major theme. You have the Mariupol theater attack where children were sheltering. Deti, that word means children. It was still struck. That one was hard. You have the fortress Azovstal that falls. There was the Azovstal battalion that held out here for months and months and months. That finally falls on May 16th of the original year. The liberation of Mariupol, right? That's what the Russians claim, that they're here to liberate the Ukrainians from the Nazi regime of Zelensky, who has Jewish heritage. So there's a lot going on in that. But that's what liberation looks like. Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2022 are actually widely successful. They're able to drive them out of the north and really hem them in to the eastern provinces and the Crimean Peninsula that they took in 2014. Again, Battle of Kharkiv, so much ordnance was used in that. Looks like a World War I battle. In Russia, you have opposition groups popping up and met with swift resistance from the police, at least to arrest. Speaking out against the war still to this day remains a very political, very risky thing to do. Can lose you your job, lose you your career, get you sent to prison. It becomes even more unpopular with the mobilization effort in 2022. By the fall, Russia has gone through its basically troops that it brought in initially, and over 300,000 men are conscripted. You see attacks on conscription offices of people that don't want to go, but many thousands do. You have the Kerch Bridge attack, which this bridge is like the primary connection point between Crimea and Russia. Ukrainians blew up a oil-carrying rail car on that and collapsed part of that bridge. It was a very major escalation on the part of the Ukrainians. You have the fighting around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, which for a country that, we didn't talk about this, but for a country that experienced the Chernobyl disaster in 1985, this is major scale. In the winter, Russia begins targeting infrastructure, particularly oil and gas infrastructure, to heat electricity. It was a very cold winter. The offensive still continues, though, all the way through 2022. 2022 was a better year for Ukraine than 2023 was in a lot of ways. Though in 2023, you have a state official visit by a sitting U.S. president to a war zone. That was pretty big. But Putin celebrated it in his own way in Russia. He had his own year. It was a very patriotic display. And he vowed to keep fighting. He turned more to those conscripted troops. You also had his mercenary groups, like the Wagner group, led by Prigozhin, who, that turned around and backfired, felt that his troops were not being treated fairly, were being underarmed, or sent in as the first wave, and so they marched on Moscow. And that was one of the most destabilized moments I've seen the Putin regime in 24 years. That was the closest it came. But when you look at it realistically, the threat petered out about that fall. And Prigozhin flees to Belarus. He's given assurances that all is forgiven. A couple months later, his plane explodes. Who's to say what happened? And now, the current state. I meant to have a slide about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Ukrainian counteroffensive that was funded, largely through international aid. They were waiting for Abrams tanks. They were waiting for missile systems. They were waiting for air defense systems. And then you had to held or regain. This is all basically that they were able to reestablish control from that. A lot of men went into this offensive. A lot of munitions, a lot of artillery pieces, a lot of heavy armor went into this offensive, and they largely got held up because Russia had time to dig in and they had that defender's advantage. But still, along this line, fighting remains incredibly intense. It's just that we don't see those dramatic swings in the front like we did in the early days of the war. So that's where things kind of stand now. Just in terms of cost, some estimates have Russia having spent over 3.1 trillion rubles, somewhere in the $211 billion to deploy, feed, have these troops fighting in Ukraine. Somewhere estimates upwards of 300,000 Russian troops have been killed, and that includes the conscripts mobilized. Just recently, this report came out that current fighting, it's largely conscripts, Russian conscripts that are being thrown into the front lines, and they're underprepared and they're understaffed, and that they're taking the brunt. 50,000 was in the last year. Russian casualties really accelerated. Ukraine had received more than $43 billion in international aid. That number is going up. Even just in the time since I wrote this slide, the U.S. Congress approved, I believe, another $61 billion in aid for Ukraine. And in 2023, they were spending roughly $135 million a day on military operations. Now, Ukrainian casualties are very hard to calculate because they keep those numbers under wraps. They don't want, it's a PR game for Zelensky. He needs the West believing that they can sustain that fight, that they're capable of it if he wants to see that money. And so it's a lot more difficult to get an accurate cost of that. That brings us up to date, and I wanted to leave myself a little bit more time than I probably took for like Q&A, and I don't know if we have time that we need to be out of here, so I would be very happy if you have questions on anything that I covered or anything that you would like to know more about. Definitely want to get to. If you're interested in this topic, you want to learn more about the region, particularly like the Mennonite side of things. Mennonites in the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union by McPherson. He's a big name in the world of Soviet history. I would recommend that one. I haven't read Dr. Staples' work. That's also one that I found. And then Kate Brown, a biography of No Place. That kind of inspired a little bit. She really digs in. This was such a multi-ethnic community. And then you have mass displacements, you have wars, you have, now it is very much homogenized Ukraine. Yes, there's Russian speakers, yes, there's Ukrainian Tatars, but you don't have the same level of Mennonites and Jews and this very vibrant community because of these wars, and she traces that story very well. So, all right, thank you so much for listening to me drone, and I would love to take your questions.
Can we trust the news we hear, U.S. media?
I would say, and I say this to my students as well, the more diversified your sources are, the more likely you're going to get to an approximation of the truth. I don't have my visual aid that I usually do, but the more objective that you can get, the better. And I like to go outside of U.S. media, personally. I'll check The Guardian, I'll check Al Jazeera, I'll check the BBC, in addition to things like NPR. I'm not particularly, we don't have cable in my house, so I'm not particularly plugged into the cable news cycle, so I can't speak to how they're covering it. But the more sources that you have, the more approximate you can, and be critical of those sources, right? Particularly any source that you look at. Read with a critical eye. Who are they talking to? Who are they quoting? Who are they, where is their information coming from, right? Is it coming from a paid propagandist for that side, right? Probably don't go on Russia Today. I wouldn't recommend it. Not the most objective. But yeah, great question.
Are there no Mennonite groups in Ukraine today?
To my knowledge, I believe that there might be some descendants, but that there is not, it's not in the same way that there were in the 18th century, right? In the sense that just life has changed from those ethnic enclaves where villages could be all Mennonite. now they probably live in cities with hundreds of thousands of other people.
No, I understand, but
Yeah.
are there Mennonite churches, are there groups that identify themselves as Mennonites within Kiev or Kherson or various, I'm just wondering.
That's a great question. It's one that I don't fully know the answer to. If so, I mean, it would probably be a post-Soviet kind of reconnection because there probably wasn't a lot of room for it. I mean, in general, religious organizations in the Soviet Union had difficulties operating, but it wouldn't surprise me if there are heritage organizations. I know that there are a couple non-Ukrainian groups there, but in terms of how big those populations are, I wouldn't want to guess. But I would imagine you could still find descendants of some of those settlers.
I know, just to add to that, I was in Ukraine with MCC before the war started. In Zaporozhye, where I was living, there was 5 Mennonites in the church.
Really?
And with me and Mike, that meant there was 7 in total, and they were all very happy about that.
That would be, yeah, that would
If
be
you go
about
further south, like Molotchny and that area, you get a lot more Mennonites, but right there in a lot of the cities, it's very few.
yeah.
Because they were really excited to then have 7 who were actually living in the city.
And
So,
Zaporozhye is a pretty big.
yeah,
pretty
like
big city.
700,000 at the time, yeah.
It's, yeah. So wait, 5 in the whole city of?
Yeah, five in all of Zaporozhye, and plus 2 with me and Mike were there, so. But yeah, it was a very, yeah, they also, the house they had been using as the church, they gave to the program I was working with to use because there's only 5 people, they were all in their 80s and 90s. Yeah.
Usually I would say too, they're just like here, civil organizations that want to preserve that sense of cultural identity, very strong across Russia and Ukraine. Like you still will find those for, all sorts of different groups, for denominations, for ethnic groups, what have you. They exist. They probably just do take some digging to find them and make contact. Yeah. Any other questions I can answer?
I'm curious what you're planning for your dissertation. How is that city rebuilt? What you learn?
Yeah, so oh, that's so far. No, I'm not. Okay. Let me find in comparison very equal. Very similar size city, about 500,000 people, to Stalingrad at the outbreak of the war. So my dissertation picks up in 1943, right as the German surrender ends, effectively. The troops keep moving towards the west, and the city has to essentially go into triage, right? First and foremost, you've got to clear it of bodies, unexploded munitions, clear away rubble. You still have about 8,000 people living in the city center and several thousand more in the city suburbs. Those become kind of the nucleus of renewal. But largely it's a transplant city. Very few Stalingraders who survive the war, end up surviving the whole war, coming back. It becomes a city of by and for refugees, right? People that were displaced out of Ukraine or other war-torn areas, or who moved there as professionals into the construction industries, which are booming. It's really a story of a evolving 20-year construction site. And I look at it through the death of Stalin, because after Stalin you have a very different mindset of how to rebuild the city. You get the multi-story panel, refurbished concrete panels that have become known as Khrushchevki. They're 5 stories, single-family apartment. They're kind of falling apart now. But at the time, that was the way of, okay, I have 500,000 people that are homeless. How do I get the most people housed in the quickest amount of time, the cheapest, because resources are scarce all the way around. And so I look at the kind of the hard decisions that they have to make on some of those things, and how civil society reemerges, and how, you know, there's official Soviet culture, like, hey, yes, we want you to come to our lectures about Marxism-Leninism, but they're like, no, we're going to catch a Tarzan movie and then go swim in the river. So it examines kind of a range of different things there for the 20 years after Stalingrad.
For the Sir-Vegan line, how long do you think those areas that have been mined will stay mined after the war's over?
That's a great question. I think it depends on how the war ends and whose control they end up with. Dr. Kenyon at McPherson College, where I teach sometimes, we talk a lot about this, and his big thing that he teaches political science, and so his big thing is that every war starts in the battlefield, but every war is finished the same way around the table. And unfortunately in this war, the table is still not in sight, I don't think. Both sides are very dug in, both sides have a lot to lose. And so I see it grinding on, unfortunately, for some time, either until Ukraine runs out of men and funding, or public opinion in Russia gets to such a point that Putin is forced to withdraw. But I think very much it will depend on whose side the mines end on, because I don't think either side is going to really want to get rid of the buffer zone. Unless control goes back to like pre-war borders, which I think is very unlikely, right? Even if Ukraine were to sue for peace right now, they're probably not going to get everything back. The territorial line has been ripped up, irrevocably revoked, and now we've got to draw a new one. And so I think that that's going to be, I mean, things like that. Depends on who's got the upper hand when it comes to those talks of maybe. But in my experience too, demining as an effort it's dangerous. It's a lot of years worth of work, even if you're to go about pulling all those up. So.
When we were in Kyiv and in Ukraine, part of the eastern part of Ukraine was Russian-speaking people, and it was the river that was kind of dividing them. Do you think there's any chance that Ukraine would divide, and the Western group would stay Western, and the Russian speakers would actually go to Russia?
I think that sounds like an ideal case for Putin to make. I don't think that even among Russian speakers. So if we go back to this guy, who was that? This here. So this is the upper. So mostly Ukrainian speaking, right? Predominantly Russian speaking. While that is an indicator, it does not necessarily decide everything about politics. There are plenty of Russian speakers that want nothing to do with the Federation of Russia. They don't want that incorporation. There are plenty that do. It's much like think back to the occupation of the Nazis. You have a very tough choice to make. Do I declare publicly with the separatists? If I'm in a Ukrainian-held area, this might not be so good for my career prospects or my social life. If I am fighting for the, separatists, what happens? I've got to fight doubly hard, because what happens if Ukraine gets control again? Now I'm suddenly not just a patriot of Russia, but now I'm a traitor to Ukraine, right? And there is still a Ukrainian national identity that supersedes Ukrainian nationalism. You also have, in Crimea, you have the Crimean Tatars, descendants of the Mongols that settled this region. Very ethnically different than either Russians or Ukrainian. But from what I can gather, I had a friend who did a lot of study on Crimea. From what I can gather, they see themselves more as Ukrainian than they do Russian. And that's just due to the last 70 years, right, of being inundated as part of that. I think that if you asked a lot of them, they would rather have Crimea become its own separate entity. But that's the thing about nationalisms, right? You can subdivide, and we can break down into all these different groups. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian state is not just for Ukrainians. It is a sovereign entity that is meant to be a multi-ethnic place. And so I don't think it would ever be so simple as a straight divide. It very much so, you are correct. The western half of Ukraine, very, very much pro-support. Like, I spent time in Lvov. We took the train to Lvov when I was there. And holy cow, they do not like Russia there. They say some things in Lvov that would probably get you beat up over in the east. But at the same time, ultimately still part of the same state. Yeah, it's a tough question.
Are there other questions yet that need to be asked?
Does Putin have any serious concern for his safety?
Yes, is the short answer. Very paranoid guy. He's got, when he travels, he typically does it by armored train in the middle of the night, very secretive movements. He's very insular. COVID isolated him way even more, to the fact that, to the point where people weren't sure about just where he's getting his information, because he limits his circle so much, because he plays a very deadly game, right? We look at Prigozhin as an example. I think that Putin is very aware of something like that happening, and he takes all the necessary precautions. Getting at Putin, a sudden assassination of Putin, it would have to be somebody extremely close to him, because that's all who he lives in. Yeah, he's a very paranoid guy, but at the same time, he has, you don't stay in power for 26 years in Russia without developing a political coalition around you. And he has those networks of oligarchs in his favor. He has the TV channels because of those oligarchic connections where, even talking with some friends that have been to Russia lately, the amount of propagandized news that the average Russian consumes on a daily basis is staggering. That's not to say that everybody takes that uncritically. That's not to say that every Russian, but it does have an effect on public opinion, to the fact where Putin's approval ratings are still pretty good if you look at him. He's still got a wide political base, and so yes, he's paranoid enough to try to prevent that from happening, but I don't think that there's going to be quite, the same coup that there was against Gorbachev, unless things go really south, right? If things drag on and Russia starts losing ground, maybe. Which is why I think, too, it's important to know, Putin's investment in this conflict now very much does have a personal dimension. His personal prestige is now tied up in this conflict. And so public perception of how he's doing and what his objectives are and what he achieves, it's very important to him. Very important.
Well, we would give you your doctorate right now.
Say one more time, thank you so much for coming. I hope you learned something, and hope you keep interested, keep reading, keep being invested, because it's not part of the heritage, and keep those connections going. So, all right, thanks so much.